Okay. All right. I hope everyone is doing well. It is so good to have a chance to learn together. I'm looking forward to more chances when we can. I wanted to start with a very, again, somewhat controversial approach that is taken by the Kutzker Rebbe, which I can imagine, that will cause some consternation and disagreement. But to try and give a little bit more background about what Kutzker Rebbe was trying to say, that I think will end up changing a fascinating discussion in terms of the halacha and hashkafa of Rosh Hashanah. So whereas we're praying for Rosh Hashanah, I wanted to talk to you about the Kutzker Rebbe's approach to Akedat Yitzchak. Now, let's talk a little bit about the story of Akedat Yitzchak, which, of course, as we know, has a very prominent place in the thought process and liturgy of Rosh Hashanah. Let's see. So the Kutzker Rebbe deals with the story of the walk that Abraham takes towards the binding of Isaac. Now, the story has a very interesting arc, which, by the way, has a connection that people may not be familiar with. There's a midrash that talks about how when Abraham was walking as part of the experience of Akedat Yitzchak, about the binding of Isaac, so he traveled, and the Satan tried to put all sorts of roadblocks in front of him. So he traveled to the mountain where he was supposed to bind Isaac, and then there suddenly appeared, says the legend in the midrash, a river, very deep river that just got higher and higher for him not to be able to get through. And there is a famous phrase that we find, Hoshia ki higiu mayim ad nafesh. That God, he turns to God, save me, for higiu mayim, the water has reached ad nafesh, almost to the point of my soul, meaning that it become danger to my life. Higiu mayim ad nafesh. So the Magen Avraham, one of the commentaries, says that's actually one of the sources of the concept of tashlich. The tashlich is meant to be a reenactment of many of the different experiences that are relevant to Rosh Hashanah, especially the concept of tshuva. And the Magen Avraham says we don't do this, but he says that there's, because of this, a practice of walking outside the city, going somewhere distant, and having a journey towards for tashlich, to parallel Higiu Mayim ad nafesh and the journey of Avraham Avinu. Okay, anyway, a side point about the tashlich, but what happens in the story? So Abraham walks up to the mountain, and as he walks to the mountain, he is greeted with a couple of questions that he asks originally, but questions that are asked of him. For example, his son says, all right, I see all the accoutrements, I see all the equipment here. Where is the seh? Where is the animal that we're supposed to sacrifice? You told us we're on this journey, this trip to do a sacrifice. Where is the seh? And he says, the God will show us where this animal is. And you go up and down, and in fact, there's the famous Jewish tradition about the 10 tests of Abraham. And the 10 tests of Abraham delineate all these difficult things that Abraham had to go through to show, kind of forge within him his fealty to God. And within that context, the Torah lists situation after situation, time after time, where Abraham has to sort of check himself, think about what exactly it is that he's doing, and come to the difficult position to follow God's command in this seemingly most challenging command to sacrifice his son. Now, what's interesting is that the Torah does not talk much during the story of Abraham's journey towards the binding of Isaac. Doesn't talk much during the story about Abraham's emotional state, or specifically God's view of Abraham's emotional state, right? It doesn't have any sort of stops along the way where God says, "You're doing great. Everything's doing great. We're proud of you. Good job. Keep stay the course. Keep doing it." You don't see that. You see, just from Abraham's perspective, him going challenge after challenge, hurdle after hurdle, trying to get to Akedat Yitzchak and having really difficult conversations along the way, as we've mentioned. Abraham takes his son to the Mizbeach, to the altar. He ties him up. He gets the knife ready, and we know the story. At the last instant, the Malach comes and tells him, pull away. And Abraham stops. He stops and he says, just one moment, sorry. I'm just being called. I'm going to ask, we'll take a moment for station identification. Just give me a second. It's good. I apologize. Didn't mean to run out in the middle, but we're back. I'll just share the screen one more time. Sorry. Okay. So just to get back to where we were talking about, you finally get to the Akedat Yitzchak, right? The story of God tells Abraham, all right, we're taking a pause here. We don't want you to actually sacrifice your son. And then something interesting. The Pasuk says the following. Abraham stops, and God says the following words, and I'll put it here on the screen share. Ata yadati ki yarei Elokim ata. Now I know, says God, that you are a fearer of God. Ata yadati ki yarei Elokim ata. The word ata with an ayin, which means now. Now I know that you truly fear God. And the Kotzker Rebbe asked the following question. He says, if the Akedah, if this story, the binding of Isaac, is what marks Abraham as a Yirei Elokim, then how is it that this is the time that God describes him that way? Why is it that God gives him the first actual, feedback, so to speak, after he stops? Maybe God should have said, when he was about to go, I'll tell you that now I know it, by the way, you can stop. The Kotzker seems to be struggling with the fact that if this whole story is all about Abraham's fear of God, it's not the stopping that shows his fear of God. It's the fact that he did it all in the first place. Why now do you know that Abraham is a Yirei Elokim, that Abraham fears God? Why is it only after you stop that Hashem says, now I know ki Yirei Elokim ata? So many Mefarshim say, it's a little bit, it means that this whole story, this is the time that God is kind of giving a recap and looking out at the whole story. And the whole story shows that you are a fearer of God, that you have Yirat Elokim. But that's not what the Kotzker Rebbe says. The Kotzker Rebbe says something. Yes, Suzanne, sorry, you're trying to share. Go ahead. 1 second, you're still muted. You're still muted. All right, no, you're still muted. We don't hear you. There we go.
God had to stop him quickly because he wasn't sure that Abraham isn't going to be quickly in doing it.
Right.
So first he stopped him, and then he said.
And then he says, "Yirei Elokim," and that's the common Mefarshim, the common approach that many of the Mefarshim say.
I would have done the same, but
yeah.
I'm human.
But this is the Kotzker's idea. Listen to what he says, and this is again jarring, shocking, very difficult. The Kotzker says that, do you know what was truly the passing of the test? For Abraham to take Isaac off of the Mizbeach was the true test, more so than offering up in the first place. Now let that sink in for a second. It says, what showed Abraham's faith, the faith and the fear of God, Abraham's belief? The fact that he took his son off of the altar. And that was, in a certain regard, harder almost were more impressive than bringing him up to the Mizbeach. It was more difficult for Abraham to release Yitzchak than it was for him to bind him. And that's why the angel says, Ataya dati, the first, and now I know that you are really a fearer of God and Yirei Elokim. Now, this is, again, before we try and give an explanation, this is, again, a really jarring and hard to swallow statement by the Kotzker Rebbe. Yeah, Miriam, what do you want to say?
What proof do we have about his taking him off the Mizbeach? Now he knows because he took him off the Mizbeach. He should have known as soon as he said, take your son to Har Moriah. That's when he should have known that he was Yirei Elokim. I don't understand. Now that he takes him off the Mizbeach, that means that he fears God.
That's exactly the Kotzker Rebbe's question. He had your exact question. Why did God wait till now to call him a Yirei Elokim? So Suzanne was saying,
does it say somewhere in the Tanakh that he literally took him off the Mizbeach and then put the aisle on the Mizbeach?
That happened later. I'll try to see if I can bring the psukim.
I mean, by this time, of course, Isaac could have had a heart attack.
Yeah.
He could have had the most traumatic experience
100%.
that would inform the entire rest of his life.
The rest of Jewish
Nobody
history.
talks about Yitzhak. Nobody talks about the poor kid of 30 years old.
Yeah.
No, the Bible doesn't even mention that he was traumatized for life.
So we'll talk about that. Yeah. Suzanne.
The thing is that, do you hear me?
Yeah.
The thing is that now Abraham thinks, how am I going to look at the eyes of my son from now on?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Says that? Where does it say that?
No, that's Suzanne's explanation. That maybe that's why it says it right now after he stops, because it's going to be much more difficult going forward.
We don't see anymore, and we don't see anymore a connection afterwards in the Bible.
So I want to share with you an explanation of the Kotzker Rebbe's approach, shared, actually written by Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, alav hashalom, who passed away not long ago. So he says that there is no thought to think that Abraham had some sort of, positive pleasure in sacrificing Isaac. Abraham is not this idealistic sadist or masochist. If you think that is what the Kotzker Rebbe means, it's absolutely, misreading and undoing the entire meaning of the Akedah. What he says is the Kotzker Rebbe is using this as a extreme paradigmatic example of a very powerful psychological and human emotion. Human nature is such that once you've taken a very clear position in life, especially if you have suffered for it, right? If you have dedicated your life to a particular path, a particular direction, and you've sacrificed for that path or for that endeavor, and you have put your heart and soul into that endeavor, to retreat from that is extremely difficult. I'll share with you, sort of an interesting example. When you have someone who has devoted their life, let's say, to proving that the earth is flat, and they have gone to conferences and written books and distributed materials and, spent years and years researching and arguing, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you would just tell someone who's a school child, we once thought the earth was flat, but it's round. The child would say, okay, no problem, and move on with life. The earth is round. However, if you have been a past president of the Flat Earth Society, right, and if you have dedicated, your life to being a proponent of a flat earth theory and flat earth advocacy, et cetera, someone coming and sharing with you that the earth is round, to retreat and now turn 180 degrees to an opposite position, it would be really difficult. And for someone, for example, who let's say, has been taking, ridicule at all the scientific conferences because they were describing the earth as flat and they thought the earth was flat, and they were just so strong in this conviction and this opinion and this approach. And again, their whole career has been built on speaking at flat earth conferences. Such a person is going to be much, much more difficult. Not simply because it's a question of the facts versus, whatever it may be, but it's when you have committed and taken a clear position in life, it's very hard to undo that commitment. It's part of our normal psychology. If you invest time and energy, if you invest loyalty and commitment, if you invest your reputation and your prestige to a certain approach, it's very hard for us to change. We can't change because not only are we saying, hey, the earth isn't flat, but when you would announce, you, the president of the Flat Earth Society, so to speak, would announce that you now think that the earth is round, what are you saying? You're not saying something about the earth per se. You're saying something about your own past. And you're saying everything I have worked for and fought for and put my reputation on the line for and has been invalid. It's been inauthentic. And so in many ways, natural human nature is that self-justification of our past is a big part of what has the potential for dictating our future. And I'll say that again. What psychology in the mind of the Kotzker Rebbe suggests is that a major part in what you do to dictate your future is making sure that you justify your past. And so a person who has gone so much in this direction is going to have a hard time changing direction, not just because they really believe the earth is flat, but it's because they are so invested and have a natural tendency to not break that investment, saying that, you know what, not only is the earth round, but I've been a waste of all my time and all my work and all of my effort for so long. So the person, even when presented with perhaps even almost irrefutable evidence of the fact that your position is wrong, will still have a hard time accepting a different position because of what it says about my past. Not just about what the issue, the particular is. And again, to be very, very careful here, not to try and pretend to, venture into political debate. But by the way, that is something that we see in the nature of polarized political debate, where especially when it's differently, hotly held and vehemently held opinions that you have on different sides of an argument, logic may not be the only thing at play. And when you try to convince someone, oh, this position on this political issue is right, and that position is wrong, and that person has invested time and effort into advancing this particular approach, and it's irrelevant of what the subject matter is. That person, it's really hard to change people's minds because it's not just your mind that they're changing. It's their self-concept that you're changing. It's their understanding of who they are and what they've invested their time and their self into that you're trying to change. And that's very difficult because when you're saying, no, your political position is wrong, or no, your position on the flatness of the earth is wrong, you're saying you've also wasted years, reputation, money. You've wasted all that stuff by following the position that you've been taking up until this point. And so let's, again, says the Kotzker Rebbe in a very jarring thing, let's put ourselves in Abraham's shoes for a moment. Consider what he had to invest in his initial decision to follow Hashem's command, right? He had to overcome enormous inhibitions as a father, as a human being, as a person with, as we've seen, inherent sense of logic and morals. And yet God said so, so I'm going to bring Isaac up on the altar. Chazal describe, actually, if you look at some of the Midrashim, the inhuman anguish that Avram had to undergo between the time that he had to, the divine commandment that Hashem commanded him, and the actual getting to the altar. There is a phrase that Rabbi Dr. Lamb writes. He says, in those 3 days, it's as if he had lived 300 years. right? His whole future, his beloved Yitzchak, the child, the God had promised him and had delivered miracles, or his wife and he, who were so old to have this child, right? The God had promised him that this would occupy his land, and now he's supposed to destroy this child in his very hands. You know, the inhibitions that Avram had to overcome because of his devotion to God. He had to cut out a whole part of his heart. He had to subdue the tenderest, gentlest, most powerful love in order to obey what seemed to be such a cruel demand of God. Here, I was reading this from Rabbi Lamb. Let's see. I'll try and put it up here. It's a very powerful. It's a very powerful phrase. Here, these are words from Rabbi Lamb. It says this was his entire future, his beloved Yitzchak. He was the one that God had promised him, that his seed would occupy his land. And now he ordered him to destroy this child with his very hands. What greatness, what enormous and even inhuman devotion was required of Abraham. He had to cut out a whole part of his heart. He had to subdue the tenderest, gentlest, most powerful love, the love of a father to a child, in order to obey what seemed to be such a cruel demand of Hashem. So, if you think about it in the psychological terms that we raised, here, I'll try and make it a little larger so people can see. In the psychological terms that we raised, the investment that Abraham had to make to get this far is inhuman. But, and now here I'll bring a different text. But, says the Kotzker Rebbe, once he crossed that threshold, once he made his decision, in his mind, Isaac was already dead. At this time, after having made that historic, heart-rending, and soul-wrenching psychological decision, at this point when Abraham held up his hand holding a knife above Isaac, he had, in the reality of his heart and mind, already sacrificed his son on the Akedah. The pain, the suffering, the renunciation, all of it was over. Only the anticlimax of the actual physical act remained to be done. That's what Rabbi Lamb writes. So what he's suggesting, the Kotzker Rebbe means, is to basically saying, God is giving us, the reader, a lesson in the power of human psychology. And saying that once you've invested that, you're already past that threshold. You've defined yourself essentially in a murder. And so the Malach says, stop. And says the Kotzker Rebbe, what Abraham turns around and says, you've already made me a murderer in my eyes by getting here. What kind of games are you playing with me? Why did you get me to that point of abandoning my principles, of getting rid of my most powerful love, inuring me to the shock of the potential concept of murder? For what? For nothing. That's not that he was wanting in any way, shape, or form to sacrifice his son, but he was reflecting on that pivot, which is almost impossible for a human being to do. And so when the Malach says stop, that shines a light on what's really being asked of Abraham, which is abandon everything. Abandon all the courage that you've had to take to try and recreate your sense of morality, your entire sense of self. But Avram's a Yirei Elokim. And a Yirei Elokim, a God-fearing man, doesn't look to his own investment, his own reputation, his own sacrifice. He only cares about the will of God. And so he's willing to surrender the justification of his past conduct and start it all over again. He had invested pain, pride, reputation, right? The whole world was thinking, what are you doing? And he's willing to say, you know what? I was wrong. All of that is bankrupt. All of that was barking up the wrong tree, so to speak. And so Abraham's greatness is evident not only in the Akedah or the journey in the first place, but the concept of stopping showcases his willingness to do that pivot. And in that way, Rabbi Lamb suggests, he says, it's in a certain way, the sacrifice is the binding of Isaac, the stopping is the Akedat Avraham. And so that's why he suggests that phrase, Ata Yadati. Most of the Mefarshim disagree with this Kotzker Rebbe, but that's what he says, that's why the phrase Ata Yadati, now I know, is infused into the story exactly at that point, after Abraham stops. And just I'll add one piece, I know that there's some comments, but that's maybe why the Akedah is part of Rosh Hashanah. Not only because the tradition is that the Akedah happened on Rosh Hashanah, but Rosh Hashanah is the time of Teshuvah. What's Teshuvah? It's making that pivot. It's return. It's saying, I was going in this direction, now I got to go that way. And it's not only a concept or a question of going one way or the other, but declaring that all that time, all that effort, all that investment, it was wrong. It was bankrupt. And that's a extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And so the concept of that's why that was showcasing that Yirat Elokim. And tshuva, in a certain regard, implies that I have to do a little bit of invalidating of my ego, confessing that my past isn't necessarily justified. And maybe the things that I've done now up until now have been not always the right thing to do. And so when Avram obeyed the voice of the angel telling him to stop, to release Yitzchak, he had to say, all the journey I've gone until now wasn't necessarily the way that I truly define myself. And that, I think, has been a background to why we have this connection between Akedat Yitzchak and Rosh Hashanah. All right, I know there were some thoughts, and we'll take a break and then we'll go further. Go ahead, Suzanne. Yeah, you got to unmute though. But we still don't hear you. I'm sorry, Suzanne. One more time. Got to press the unmute. There we go. Wait, there we go. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Very nice if we're talking psychology. But now let me put it in not sublime feelings, but stupid human who has only human emotions. The moment that this thing was over, there was probably some relief, but on the other said, now you know it. You had to put me through that part again, through this that was never so horrible for anyone before.
And that's, I think, a big part of
for you to know.
And that's exactly.
And from that on, there was not this warm relationship between God and Abraham because they never connect again. He never connects with Isaac, and that's it.
So, but
it's
the
one of the most horrible stories in the Tanakh.
Yeah, that's right.
I can't tell you how much I hate it.
Because of the issues that you're raising.
It's a little bit less Job because Job.
Right, I'll let you.
God doesn't need to show us Satan.
Mm-hmm.
It maybe shows something about belief, and that's what the philosophers made out of Job. Right.
And Kierkegaard and Fear and Trembling, yeah. Maxine, did you have something you also wanted to add?
Yes, I've been. I was thinking very hard about this, and I was thinking that Abraham, when he got the order to go take Yitzhak to the of course, he hesitated, and then he said he had so much faith in Hashem that okay, let's go, let's see. But he knew in his heart that Hashem would not ask him to kill his son. The more I think about this, the more, because to me, I mean,
how could it be? How could it be?
And right, it's impossible.
And in certain regard, the Kotzker Rebbe is agreeing with you, and he's saying that the job of the story of the Akedah was perhaps exactly to sort of show this model of, yes, God was never planning him to kill his son, but to show that based on your faith in God, you can pivot and forego self-justification. And the job of this story, so to speak, was to teach this lesson. And maybe exactly as you were saying, that could never have been. Rabbi Telushkin, who came to Beth Jacob, gave a lecture on this, and he suggested that, and you see this in a couple of different ways in other mafarshim, that the story here was all about renouncing the pagan ritual of sacrificing a son. And so he was the way to show that God does not want this to happen, because that was not an uncommon way of worshiping in the mindset of many of the pagans. So you get almost to that point and God says you to stop. That shows that God renounces this kind of worship and does not approach it and does not approve it.
Exactly.
So that was his theory when he
got to say the most important thing.
This was an example to the world that you don't do this.
That was his argument that he made. Yeah, Suzanne, sorry.
The one thing the only consolation I found is by the answer that it was our cousin who gave me that. He said, according to him, I'm allowed to say that Abraham did not pass this test.
Because.
And you know what? That makes so much sense to me. And so my fight now is with the rabbinics.
Okay. But I want to explore that, but I want to just try and get back to this because we're getting late.
It's not good to I gave you all the basis to make ethical decisions. Now you.
Interesting. Okay, but I want to get back to our topic because I wanted to get to the concept of halacha. But the shofar is associated with the akedah, and if our approach here is that we are, remembering this story with the blowing of the shofar, is essentially what I would say is the shofar is the summons to do this. To forego self-justification. It's so much easier in life to say, everything I did up until now was right. So much easier to go and say, you know what, I've built a whole foundation of my experience to get to this point. I'm not willing to throw that away. Self-vindication is one of the easiest things to do. To say I was wrong, I'm willing to start all over again. I'm willing to abandon my self-image, to declare myself, that's a very difficult thing. And that's the challenge that the shofar summons us to do. And in a certain regard, that leads to a really interesting halacha discussion within the halacha. And again, we're running low on time, so we'll try to get through it. And this is where we have the source sheet for today. So Rosh Hashanah is described in two different ways. If you look in the pasuk, Torah says, "Daber al bnei Yisrael lemor b'chodesh hashvi'i," the 7th month, which is Tishrei, b'echad l'chodesh, the 1st month, "Yeh lachem Shabbaton," and here's the key words, "Zichron truah," which we'll translate in a moment. And that's in Vayikra. In Bamidbar, it says, "V'chodesh hashvi'i b'echad l'chodesh b'kra kodesh yeh lachem kom lechet avodah la'adasu." On this particular day, Yom Teruah yeh lachem. There's a difference. Zichron Truah, Yom Truah. Talk about the same day, but with two different descriptions. Why is that? So, the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi deal with what they see this as a contradiction, which is it? So here, in the Talmud Bavli, Amar Rabbi Levi Bar Lachma, Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina, Katuv Echad Omer. One verse says, Shabbaton Zichron Truah. And it says, one verse says, Yom Truah yeh lachem. What does that mean? So the word Zichron means remembrance. The word Yom means a day of. So what the rabbis are struggling with is, it seems to be a contradiction. One verse over here seems to say that this is a day we're supposed to blow the shofar. Truah means blowing of the shofar. It's a day of blowing the shofar, Yom Truah. This way, this pasuk over here in Vayikra talks about it as a zichron truah, a day remembrance of blowing the shofar, which implies you don't actually blow it, you just talk about it. So,
Rabbi,
yes.
I'm confused with the word Shabbaton.
Uh-huh.
First time. Shabbaton, Zichron Trua Mikra Kodesh. Why don't you say Yom? Why are you referring to it as Shabbaton? And then you don't explain what you mean by Shabbaton.
Beautiful question.
First of all, on Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar.
Ah, you're getting to that point. Yes. Yes. So we'll get to that in a moment. So the simple answer is Shabbaton in the Talmud refers to a day of ceasing of work. So it's a day in which, so if it would just say Yom Tru'ah, you wouldn't have known up until you get to this pasuk, right? But from this pasuk, you wouldn't have known it's a day that's a Yom Tov. It could have been a day that you go to work, you do, and by the way, you blow some shofar. But so Shabbaton is added to show that it's a Yom Tov. But your point is it's hinting at something else, which is maybe if it's Shabbaton, that means on a Shabbat, it's only Zichron Truah. It's only a remembrance of the Truah. But if it's a weekday, then it's Yom Truah. Then it's a day. So maybe this is the source that we don't blow the shofar on Shabbat. And take a look. That is exactly what the Talmud says. Kan b'yom tov shechal liot b'Shabbat. When it talks about just talking about the shofar blowing, that's on Yom Tov. That happens on Shabbat. Kan b'yom tov shechal liot b'chol. No, the other situation is when Yom Tov happens on a weekday. And if you look at the Talmud Yerushalmi, says the same thing. Katuv echad yom omer yom truah. Katuv acher omer yom zichron truah. One verse says it's a day of blowing of the shofar. One verse says it's a day of remembering about blowing the shofar. Haketzad, how is this possible? B'sha'ah shehu chol b'chol yom truah. When Yom Rosh Hashanah is on a weekday, then it's a day of blowing the shofar. When it's a Chal Shulu Chal b'Shabbat, when it's on a Shabbat, right? As Miriam pointed out, the word Shabbaton, then all you do is talk about the blowing the shofar, right? So that's how the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, that's how they resolve what appears to be a contradiction based on exactly Miriam's point, the word Shabbaton. Great. Only one problem. The next line in the Talmud, Amar Rava. Rava says, 1 second here. All of this assumes that we don't blow the shofar on Shabbat. But there is one problem. Bamikdash hechitakinan. Says, did you know that the practice was that in the Beit HaMikdash, they blew the shofar even on Shabbat? So if what we were saying in the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli and what Miriam was pointing out is true, that fundamentally we should not blow the shofar on Shabbat, as the verse implies, how dare they blow the shofar in the Beit HaMikdash on Shabbat? The holiest place in the world. They're violating what this verse says. So therefore, the Babylonian Talmud has a different approach. It says something very interesting. The Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Allah Amar Rava, Midoraita Mishrashari, which means on the fundamental level, the Torah permits you to blow the shofar on Shabbat. There is a rabbinic reason why we don't. A famous thing called Gzeira de Rabbah, that for a technical reason of the concern of a violation of Shabbat, when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar. But it's a much later day development and not actually part of what the verse means to say. Okay, so just to recap, we saw a contradiction, it appears to be, in two verses. The Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, resolves that contradiction by saying that you blow the shofar only when Rosh Hashanah is on a weekday, but when Rosh Hashanah is on a Shabbat, then you have a concept of Zichron Truah. By the way, our Sidur follows the Talmud Yerushalmi. Our Sidur says that when Rosh Hashanah, if you look in the Sidur, or the Machzor, when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, you say the word Zichron Truah. You add the word, this is a day of remembrance of the shofar, reminiscent to what's said here in the Talmud Yerushalmi. But the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, says that that can't be the way to resolve the contradiction. Because Zichron Truah can't refer to a day where you are supposed to only remember and talk about the shofar but not blow it, because in the Beit HaMikdash, we did blow the shofar. And so the Rashi, let's see if I have Rashi here. Rashi says a very interesting idea. Rashi tells us that Zichron Truah means that you have a two-part mitzvah when it comes to blow the shofar. One part of the blowing the shofar is the toot, right, is the blowing. That's the hearing the blast of the shofar, that's one part of the mitzvah. But there is a second part of the mitzvah, which is not just to blow, but to have a zichron, which means to have a recognition, an understanding, a remembrance along with the blowing of the shofar. Right? And so it's not a contradiction. There are two sides of the same mitzvah. One part of the mitzvah is blow the shofar or hear the shofar being blown. And the other part of the mitzvah is have that raise a remembrance within you. How do we do that? We do that with what's called the Zechirat Torah, and we do that with the prayers. So there's a mitzvah to pray, and a mitzvah, I should say, to pray on the shofar, and a mitzvah to blow or hear the shofar. So the Ramban disagrees, and there's a whole much more that we won't have time for to go into. But I want to just recap and get to the point. So Rashi seems to believe that there is a fundamental requirement to not only blow the shofar, but to speak about it, to have a zikaron with it. Essentially, Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Teruah, a day of blowing the shofar, but is only truly complete when you add the element of Shabbaton is Zichron Teruah, as Miriam was saying, of the remembrance, of meaning to it. And by the way, that's in fact what the famous phrase means, which is, the Torah says, let me see if I can find it. Let's see if I have it here. Here it is. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Talmud Rishon, God says, Imru lefanai b'Rosh Hashanah malchiot zichronot b'shofarot. Say these three things, which is the cornerstones of Musaf on Rosh Hashanah. Malchiot, God's kingship, Kedesh Tamlichuni Aleichem, making God reign upon us. Reign, not reign, like reign as the king. Zichronot, become remembrance, Kedesh Yavol Lefanai Zichronechem L'Tovah. Uvamen, how are you supposed to do this with the shofar? This is the concept of Zichron Truah, that you blow the shofar, and the shofar is hand in hand with the themes of the day. So if that's the case, Rosh Hashanah has these two components. Maybe the Kotzker Rebbe's idea has a new concept. We're not supposed to only blow the shofar. We are not supposed to only hear the blast, but to truly fulfill what it means, you also have to have an understanding of what we're doing, what it means to us, and what does zikaron generally refer to? Zikaron means a contemplation of your past. Remember what the Kotzker Rebbe taught? That this was this concept of tshuva, this whole story of the Akedah that the shofar reminds us of is all about. It's about looking back with a sense of, okay, so I would call it realism and flexibility about your past. That's what tshuva is. Looking back at the past with a critical eye and saying, you know what? I need to be willing to let go of some of that. If we just have the shofar alone, we might not internalize its message of remembering the good things, but also being willing to renounce the mistakes and the challenges of the past. So the Torah commands us, do a zichron Torah, say these special psukim, say these verses remember the fact that God's our king, and remember the fact that he gave us the tools to be willing to walk away from our ego, drop some of the baggage that we've brought along. And that, I think, is perhaps, again, the Kutzker Rebbe was a very jarring approach, but that's the connection between the concept of the Akedah and the Tshuva and the Shofar, and I would say the inspiration through Halacha. The Halacha requires us to not, according to Rashi, only blow the Shofar, but internalize its message of how we have a different look, a different approach to look at the past. And I think that's the kind of brings all the pieces together of the focus on Akedat Yitzchak and the focus on the Shofar and Rosh Hashanah. And so I hope that we all have the special merit to have a wonderful, and I would say to everybody, a better next year that should be connected and healthy for all of us, and that we should be able to really internalize that message of the Shofar and have that complete Tshuva Shlema that will allow us to be Zocha to a Shana Tova U'Metuka. So I want to wish everyone a wonderful Chag, and we'll reconvene afterwards, but it has been such a pleasure. Hopefully we'll be able to connect really well in the future. Okay, let's hear some comments. Yes, Suzanne, go ahead.
Which part is the fulfilling the mitzvah of shofarot? Tki'ah and tru'ah, or only tru'ah, or only tki'ah?
Great question. And so that is the approach. The question was not only asked by you, it was asked by Rabbi Abahu.
The shvarim belong somehow either to tru'ah.
Right, so Rabbi Abahu, who basically says, we're not really sure. Now it's a machloket if it means we're not really sure, or we are sure, but we want to make sure that we do all of the different things. But the